During World War II, there was a little-known branch of the United States Navy whose job it was to serve aboard merchant ships and protect them while delivering essential war supplies to the Allied fighting forces overseas. From 1942 until mid-1945, 710 ships were sunk beneath them. Yet few people ever heard of them. That's because no one bothered to fully document a record of their achievements. Now, after more than 50 years, their long-forgotten story can finally be told. This is the story of the United States Navy Armed Guard.
When man said join the armed guard, he said, you want to see the world? You got to see the world. At least I did. And you go see Davy Jones too. But they don't tell you that part.
I heard about them and how they would come out and knock a whole convoy off, maybe 39 out of 42 ships, I understand. But that was something really to be scared of. And
it's been said many a time that a 100-ship convoy would stop through there and 6 or 8 may get through.
I didn't know what the armed guard was. They didn't know what the armed guard was. The only thing that they knew, and I didn't know until after I got in there, that we was setting ducks, that we had a one-way ticket, and we wasn't going to be coming back.
And about 3:20 in the morning, just before to get the other crews up, Hank Karingi, who was our petty officer over us, he was on duty at that time too. I was on that watch, and standing watch on the stern of the vessel by a 4-inch 50. We got hit at the stern near the fiddly room. I mean, the ship literally went straight perfectly up in the air and straight down. It went down so fast that when I looked, here's a big phosphorus foam coming like a big mouth at us.
I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed.
Following the sneak attack at Pearl Harbor, which almost destroyed the entire American fleet, the United States now faced on both sides of her the seasoned military powers of Japan and Germany. Caught completely unprepared, the nation's almost non-existent fighting forces had to be rebuilt in a hurry. And they were also faced with another overwhelming and seemingly impossible task: the mass production of vital war goods and the means of getting it overseas, wherever needed, through treacherous enemy waters. American industry swiftly mobilized and swung into action. Within months, it started turning out unbelievable volumes of tanks, planes, guns, and other supplies needed to support a fledgling military force, and at the same time provide help to Great Britain and Russia, who were teetering on the brink of defeat at the hands of Germany. The heavy burden of delivering those goods overseas fell on the shoulders of the already battle-scarred United States Merchant Marine. As early as 1941, the merchant fleet had been running war supplies to Great Britain under the American Lend-Lease Act in her war against Germany. Although the United States was not at war, the unprotected American merchant ships nonetheless suffered massive sinkings at the hands of the dreaded German U-boats. The American merchant marine seaman was already a war veteran long before the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor.
The merchant marine, I tell all we on the same boat in the same ship. Those torpedoes was out there, wasn't meant for just the armed guard. It was out there meant for the people who ran the ship, which was a merchant marine, and most of those was in the engine room.
Immediately following the entry into the war, the United States Navy quickly began arming the merchant ships with a newly formed branch called the Navy Armed Guard. In those early days, they were mostly gunners, maybe one radio man and a signalman, and a petty officer, ensign, or lieutenant as their commanding officer.
Well, that usually wasn't always the case in the early days of the war, because when the Armed Guard was being formed, they were short of officers to be in charge of the gun crews. So sometime a seaman first class would be assigned to the Armed Guard, and they'd ask him, "You know anything about guns?" He says, "Well, I may know something about a rifle or a hunting gun." And they put him in charge of the gun crew, and within days he'd be on a ship and he'd be sent overseas.
So the gunnery officer got me as soon as I got aboard ship, and he says, "Well, you got a bunch of seamen here that don't know nothing about guns." And I says, "I don't know too much about guns." He said, "Well, we're going to put you in charge of there's about 20-some men here." And I says, "Well, okay." I said, "I'm not a gunner's mate, I'm just a seaman's first class." And he says, "Well, I'm going to give you a book." And he says, "You read that book through, and then I'll give you your gunnery test."
The ships they sailed on were nothing more than slow rust buckets, overloaded with planes, tanks, oil, and ammunition. Their guns, if they even had any, were obsolete, and on many occasions wouldn't even fire.
No guns. I was the only signalman. Second ship was a Canadian. No guns. I was the only American. Third ship, we had a 7-man gun crew under a coxswain. And the fourth ship, again, no guns. I was the only American. It was British.
All we had was 30 caliber machine guns on each starboard and port sides. And on the bridge and flying bridge, there were 50 caliber machine guns. That was our ammo, our protection.
Living conditions on the early ships were usually deplorable, and recreation facilities were non-existent. They didn't even have a doctor on board. And in the North Atlantic, where convoys were running supplies to Russia from Great Britain, their chances of being sunk by a German U-boat were 1 in 3. Hardly the honor and glamour one would experience on a warship.
One convoy coming back, we lost 19 out of 42 ships. Yes, sir. No, that's the way it was, you know, in the beginning of the war.
The convoy that we were in, we had about, I think, 75 ships in it, something like that. And when we landed in Liverpool, I believe it was, England, why we had lost, in our convoy, we had lost, I think it was 27 ships.
To make the crews of the Armed Guard feel even more isolated, their fellow Navymen often regarded them as not being real Navy.
I was in New York once in a bar one night, and 2 sailors come up to me, and I don't remember, they made some smart remark. So I told them, I said, "You never set a lifeboat all night with ice all over your back, did you?" Because that night we were in the lifeboat with that salt water run up on us. There was so many of us in the lifeboat, and it was set so low in the water, and the water was rough. And that salt water freezes on our backs, on our clothes, on the coats. And I asked him, I said, "You never sat there so in the lifeboat all night and ice all over your back, did you?" And him and his buddy got up and left. That was all they said to me. They got up and left.
Part of the Navy doesn't recognize that we existed, and especially the groups that went on the Murmansk run. My God, that's Every time I got an assignment, I just thanked God that I didn't catch a mermaid squad.
I found out we were having reunions, and I found out the lack of respect that we had or didn't have, and I was a little bit upset because we were out there. We were just waiting for things to happen, doing our job.
Training for the Naval Armed Guard, inadequate as it was, got underway in early 1941. The government's plan, although a cautious one, was to put Navy men aboard merchant ships to protect them, even if the United States wasn't at war with Germany. But the project lacked serious effort, and it wasn't until October of 1941 that the Navy camp at Little Creek, Virginia became the first official armed guard training site. There was hardly any guns to train with, and what there was outdated World War I equipment.
We trained on 4-inch 50s and 50 caliber guns and 30 caliber Lewis's and Marlins. Didn't have 20 milliliters. They didn't have no 20 millimeters or 40s or nothing. All of them were old, obsolete guns.
Following Pearl Harbor, and as more young men moved into the armed guard, training switched to Camp Shelton, Virginia. Then came New Orleans, the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and Treasure Island in San Francisco.
It seemed like the big need at this time was for gun crews on merchant ships, which I knew nothing about. So they shipped a lot of us from Great Lakes to Treasure Island in San Francisco.
And I had a whole crew. They assigned me of teenagers from New York that got out of high school, and they sent them right to Brooklyn, New York Navy Yard and put them in the armed guards.
There were shortages of everything. At one training center, there was one inadequate gun for every 500 men.
Some of the first weapons put on merchant ships were nothing more than poles, telephone poles. They were put on merchant ships to disguise, they looked like they had guns on board. And it's kind of hard to believe that they put those on the board of ship and go in those early convoys and think they're going to fake out a German wolf pack. But that's what they did.
As American war production started to accelerate, shipyards began launching merchant ships at an incredible rate. Losses to enemy submarines and air attacks were continuing at a staggering rate, and the battle cry to keep the supply lines moving was to build them faster than they can sink them. But it was still the early stages of the war, and more modern and powerful weaponry for the decks was still yet to come. The American mass production of war goods was so staggering that it not only stunned the Axis powers, but the Allies as well. Certainly the most amazing achievement were the shipyards. During the peak of the war years, thousands of cargo vessels were launched, some in a matter of days. The majority of these ships were tankers, the famed Liberty ships, otherwise known as the Ugly Ducklings, and the more up-to-date and faster Victory ships. Navy Armed Guard units were attached to all of them. But there was something unique about the Liberty ships that set them apart from the rest. Those that served on board usually developed a strange, contradicting love affair with the Liberties. They cussed its questionable and often dangerous construction, and at the same time would punch you in the nose if you made fun of it. Painfully slow, they couldn't handle rough seas, and it wasn't uncommon for their hulls, which were hastily welded together, to break open. Yet, they were considered the workhorse of the convoys. By the end of the war, more than 2,700 Liberty ships had been built, purposely designed to be constructed quickly and for a limited time only. A few of these ships were still sailing the seas nearly 30 years after the war. Today, only the completely refurbished SS Jeremiah O'Brien and the SS John W. Brown, both serving as sailing memorial museum ships, are the only Liberty ships left.
Here it was more than 50 years after the war ended, and I was talking to an old Merchant Marine veteran who was telling me that there was a Liberty Ship Part Museum here in Portland, and I'd never heard of it before. So my wife and I went down there and see what we could find. It was a little park, there's a big green grassy knoll, and it had some plaques there. And we discovered that there were more than 100 Liberty ship bows that were buried beneath there. They had been scrapped across the river during the 1960s and hauled over there as landfill. And then the Merchant Marine Association made this a Liberty Ship Park. And we were looking at these plaques, and I couldn't believe it. I found out my ship's name was on there. And the last time I saw the SS Edwin Markham was when I left it in Ulithi when the war ended. So it was kind of an emotional time.
When the war entered 1942, the Russian army in the east was crumbling under the onslaught of a powerful German offensive. Their only survival depended on critical war supplies getting through to them from the Allies, and the only route there was over the icy North Atlantic to Murmansk on the northern tip of Russia, near the Arctic Circle. As the summer of '42 approached, the German submarines, with very little resistance, began strangling the Allied shipping in the North Atlantic. Their deadly U-boats, prowling in wolf packs just below the surface, were having a field day against the lightly protected convoys and their inadequate guns of defense.
I ran out of the floating ice field and we torpedoed around noon. Again, in between number 4 and number 5 hatch. And that put us dead in the water then. And about an hour and a half later, then they put a torpedo in the engine room, and that broke the ship in half.
There was only one life raft left on the port side, on the windward side, between 2 torpedo holes where they had been struck by the submarine. And myself and the second mate and 2 other men, I believe, were on the life raft and stepped into the lifeboat. And we fought for, it seemed like an eternity, to get away from the side of the ship. In retrospect, I think the ship probably shifted because of the wind, and we were finally clear of the ship.
The convoys to Murmansk originated from either Iceland or Scotland, and both covered a distance of more than 1,500 miles.
The word got around what Murmansk was, and needless to say, I was scared.
Not only did the ships face massive German submarine attacks, but also ceaseless airstrikes and poundings from the Sea Raiders operating from occupied Norwegian bases.
We lost approximately half of the merchant crew and half the gun crew. It was probably lost approximately half the crew.
All this and the physical torture of the constant sub-zero weather and high seas that sometimes capsized ships and cracked hulls made the Murmansk run a constant hell.
Hey, I never seen anything like this, and here we started up there, and my God, did I ever see waves. As you know, when you're out in the level sea, when there's no waves around that, you see convoy, you see ships from horizon to horizon. But in this trip to Murmansk, believe me, the captain of the ship himself says, I never in my life, after 40 years of sailing, never did I see anything like this.
We were in the water about 7 hours. I was lucky enough to be on watch, CO of the watch, and I had all my foul weather gear on, which included face mask and goggles and hood. And when the commanding officer gave me orders to secure the ship and see that all the Navy personnel was off with their foul weather gear on, that's probably what saved more of us than it was than the merchantman, because they were just simply bedlam when everything went up in the air when the torpedo struck.
On June 24th, 1942, a convoy of 33 merchant ships, 22 American, and the rest under British, Dutch, Russian, and Panamanian flags, set out from Iceland for Murmansk and Archangel, Russia. They were being escorted by more than 40 warships, most of which were British. Because of the constant danger of German U-boat and aircraft attacks, this was to be the most heavily guarded convoy of the war. Lying in wait off the coast of Norway, ready to strike a blow at the PQ-17, was a huge German strike force, the German prize battleship Tripitz, several heavy cruisers, destroyers, U-boats, and long-range aircraft.
Little did we know about the Scharnhorst or the von Tripitz. However, heard about them and how they would come out and knock a whole convoy off, maybe 39 out of 42 ships, I understand.
On July 1st, the German surface force, led by the deadly Tripets, detected the PQ-17 as it entered the Barents Sea. Shortly thereafter, the British picked up the location of the German assault unit and became alarmed that an overwhelming attack on the PQ-17 was imminent. About the same time, the Germans intercepted another British radio signal which led them to suspect a trap was being set to destroy the Tripets. Under a direct order from Hitler, in an effort to save the Tripets, the German attack force turned around and headed back to Norway. Then something happened so odd that it would cause a bitter controversy for more than 50 years. Not knowing that the German Navy attack force had turned back, the British Admiralty, realizing now that her lightweight Navy escort units could be no match for an overpowering Tripets, and her supporting attack units ordered the Navy escorts to withdraw from the convoy. The PQ-17 was to disperse, and her ships were now on their own to reach the Russian ports.
The best figures that we have was about 72 submarines in this wolf pack, and we were completely circled by submarines practically at that time. They came up in the middle of the convoy, the destroyers behind them, and I think the Navy, our escort, had sunk about 4 or 5 of them, so the record was.
Discovering to their amazement that the ships of the PQ-17 had scattered and left to fend for themselves, the German U-boats supported by the Luftwaffe from bases in Norway struck unmercifully at the scattered and helpless ships.
When the engine room blew up, it just knocked me down just like a hand just took you and just knocked you just flat on the deck. And so I got up then and we started abandoning ship. Number 1, number 2 lifeboat was on the port side, and they let them down the water and the seals were up that broke the painter line. There was just 4 men in each lifeboat. Then the number 3 boat, which is my lifeboat station, I got on board the boat and we let it down. And then they started letting number 4 boat down. It hung up on the falls, couldn't get it down. And so anyway, none of us boys in the ship, there's 27 of us on this lifeboat. And we didn't have a knife to cut the painter loose with. And a boatswain from the state of Washington, he threw a knife down, and we cut the line, and we got away from the ship then.
On July 4th, 5th, and 6th, the relentless German attacks proved to be a catastrophic nightmare for the defenseless merchant ships. On July 5th alone, 14 ships went to the bottom.
It seemed like eternity fighting our way between those. There were 2 torpedo holes, and we were kind of in between them. But like I said a minute ago, it seemed like, I think in retrospect, that the shifted position because of the winds and the waves, because I don't think we could ever got away otherwise.
The Germans called it a shooting gallery. Some merchant ships carrying munitions and high-octane gasoline completely disintegrated from torpedo hits, blowing metal and bodies onto ships as far away as a mile. Of those ships still afloat, Navy armed guardsmen never left their guns for nearly 28 hours, a ceaseless nightmare of death, fatigue, and hopelessness of manning guns that were almost useless against the enemy attacks.
We really didn't have much to protect against. All we could do was see a conning tower. They never did surface, you know. All we could see is one little post sticking out of the water, and if you ever try to hit a post 2-3 miles out there, you know, it's pretty rough. If they would ever surface, they could fire on these American merchant marine ships with their surface gun. All U-boats had a big surface gun on the aboard their deck of the ship, the sub.
The freezing Barents Sea was escape for hundreds of Navy armed guardsmen and merchant seamen clinging to lifeboats and life rafts. Some were picked up by surviving ships. Others made it to Norway only to be taken prisoner. Many endured as much as 2 weeks in open boats only to be captured by U-boats and set adrift again. And there were those who just vanished.
And we got aboard the rescue ship, and there were 2 gunners came in later. We're just about, they got them up over the side on the cargo net and into the sick bay, and I was trying to revive one of them by rubbing his hands in his face and trying to start circulation. And I was in shock, or at that time, I wasn't during the time I was aboard ship. But my CO came over and told me there's no use to work on them anymore, they're dead, which he was, both of them.
The disaster of the PQ-17 stunned the British and United States military. Out of the original 33 merchant ships that made up the ill-fated merchant convoy, 23 were sunk, with 14 of them being American ships. A staggering 144,000 tons of badly needed war supplies for the Russians went to the bottom. It included 210 aircraft, 430 tanks, 3,300 vehicles, and untold millions of gallons of fuel and oil. The actual number of those who lost their lives in the PQ-17 disaster has never been actually counted. More than 1,500 survivors were rescued from the sea. Many were victims of frostbite that would cost them fingers, an arm, or a leg. Hundreds were hospitalized in Murmansk, where conditions were deplorable and unfriendly.
I was aboard a Liberty ship in Murmansk Harbor in Murmansk, Russia. The British Navy the night before had rescued approximately 500 Norwegian refugees off of the island of Sorora. These refugees had fled Norway at the time Germany invaded Norway and had been living on this island for a period of time. During the time that it was on the ship, I had a camera and I took several pictures, or many pictures, of these Norwegian refugees. And some 50 years later, through a British seaman, a British sailor by the name of Lynn Phillips in England, I contacted, or he contacted, the paper in Oslo, Norway, to see if they could locate any of these refugees. So several weeks later, I got a letter from each one of these girls. One of them was named Ida Peterson, who was located in Bergen, Norway, and lives in Bergen, Norway. The other girl was Dagmar Peterson, who lives in Hammerfest, Norway, the most northern town in the world. These girls each wrote me a letter back, sent me photographs of themselves, sent me a newspaper article about me trying to locate them. The article, I guess, that located them in Norway.
PQ-17's tragic voyage forced the British to suspend convoys to Russia for nearly 6 months. Accusing the Allies of betrayal, Russian Premier Joseph Stalin reacted by ordering the bedridden survivors in Murmansk back to Great Britain before they were well enough to return. Winston Churchill called the PQ-17 nightmare one of the most melancholy naval episodes of the whole war. The Battle of the Atlantic, which actually lasted from 1939 to 1945, took more lives and destroyed more ships and essential war cargo than any other battle of World War II. During those 6 years, more than 2,500 American and Allied merchant ships were sunk, and nearly 800 German submarines were destroyed. Approximately 60,000 lives paid the price. On May 5, 1945, the last U.S. Navy personnel killed by enemy action in the Battle of the Atlantic was Navy Armed Guardsman Lonnie Whitson Lloyd. He went down with the SS Black Point, only 3½ miles off Point Judith, Rhode Island. One of the strangest stories about the infamous convoys to northern Russia happened during 1943. 8 American merchant ships, with their armed guard crews, became trapped and isolated in the ports of Murmansk, Archangel, and Molotovsk. For more than 8 months, they became known as the Forgotten Convoy. Fierce winter storms dropped temperatures to as much as 40 degrees below zero. Day and night German air attacks on both convoy and ports went on for months, leaving armed guard gunners at their posts without rest for days and weeks on end.
They had dropped their bombs and off they'd go, and we just kept putting up with that for in less than a 3-month period there, or maybe a 3-month period. We had, if my memory serves me correct, I think it was something like 169 air raids. So we was pretty busy. And I swear and be darned that some of these pilots never wanted to drop a bomb on us, because I would be up on, my gun was up on a bridge, and I'd be firing away, and some of the pilots, they'd drop their bombs on the dock, and when they would look at us, they would wave at us, "Hey, like, how you doing?"
Back in the States, family members of both the armed guard and merchant crews had no word on what had happened. Were the crews dead? Missing in action? Some ships that had left New York in January of '43 hadn't been heard from until the following December.
We're known then as the two names. One was the Forgotten Convoy, and the other one was the Forgotten Bastards of Molotovsk.
In the early days of 1942, with German submarines raising havoc in the North Atlantic, the eastern seaboard of the United States also became a shooting gallery for enemy U-boats. Most Americans who thought the war was oceans away were unaware of what was literally happening on their doorstep.
First part of the war was pretty bad with U-boats. The U-boats were sinking them pretty at their wheel off of the East Coast.
Within sight of land, German U-boats were sinking unprotected cargo ships with alarming regularity. The brightly lighted New York skyline illuminated easy targets as they entered the open seas. Beachcombers along the shores of Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina watched ships explode on the horizon. And German submarines, completely undetected, were actually laying mines inside Chesapeake Bay and at the entrance to New York's unsuspecting and busy harbor.
In one 2-week period alone, there were 25 merchant ships sunk off the East Coast, just within sight of land off of Maryland and North Carolina. And there were something like 80 ships during the war that were sunk there, and at a cost of 843 armed guard and merchant marine seamen.
Among these ships was the SS Resor. German torpedoes found their mark and the ship went down in a ball of fire. Out of the 50 merchantmen and Navy armed guardsmen aboard, only 2 survived. It sunk in a matter of minutes off the coast of New Jersey. The German U-boat menace had also spread to the Caribbean. Ships were going down in shocking numbers. A total of 318 ships were lost in 1942, with some being hit as they left their harbors. The control of the Mediterranean was vital to both the Allies and the Axis. With some of the war's heaviest fighting taking place in North Africa, Sicily, Malta, Italy, efforts to keep the Allied shipping lanes open for crucial war supplies took a staggering toll. In the early going, the Axis powers dominated the skies, with bases within easy reach, airstrikes on Allied convoys in the Mediterranean, and submarine attacks on shipping in the Arabian and Indian Oceans were devastating. One sizable convoy headed for Malta was able to deliver only 4 ships. Another convoy originating from Alexandria was hit so hard it had to turn back.
Immediately after we got hit, about 3:20 in the morning, I was blown up into the air momentarily. It's amazing what a tanker with a 32-foot draft actually being lifted out of the water somewhat, if you want to say so, and then your body gets lifted up with the blast and you come back down. And immediately I went to grab, when I hit the deck, I got drenched. I presume what the whatever went up came back down was either seawater at the time, and I immediately wanted to find my jacket.
We sailed Friday the 13th. We were 13 days at sea. Around 13 minutes to 8, we were torpedoed. There was 13 of us in the lifeboat for 13 days.
When you're below the surface and there's nothing you can do about it, you can't holler to nobody. So you go in your own mind. I said to my mom, because my dad I was 16 when my dad passed away, was a fireman, and I said to my mom, I'm drowning like other sailors have drowned before me.
On April 24th, 1944, when the tide of the conflict in the Mediterranean was swinging in favor of the Allies, one of the most single-ship disasters of an American Liberty ship occurred in a large convoy off the coast of Algeria. The SS Paul Hamilton, loaded down with ammunition and Army personnel, was hit midships by a German torpedo plane. The explosion was so devastating that the ship was completely destroyed in a catastrophic explosion. All 580 aboard, including 30 Navy armed guardsmen, vanished without a trace.
And when the first torpedo hit, the concussion blew away part of the catwalk that I used to climb on top of the pontoons. And not really realizing what had happened at first, or didn't recognize it anyway, I was thrown off of the cot that I was sleeping on. And I had just finished reading Captain Blood. And the concussion tore the pages out of that book and was over top of the deck.
We saw some lights on the horizon, and being a signalman, we had the only light that we had was a spotlight, and someone had broken the flicker on it, so they held me up in the bow of the boat, and I touched the two wires together to send help, spelled out the word help, to this ship, and it came back saying stand by. So that's how we were rescued.
As the Allies started taking over the initiative in the Mediterranean, large convoys, now manned by more experienced armed guard gunners with more effective weaponry, began taking their toll on enemy air attacks. On May 11, 1944, armed guardsmen on one such convoy destroyed 13 German planes and damaged 6 others in a single encounter.
The convoy got attacked 4 times. Our ship got attacked once. And I don't know whether it was just firing a few rounds off at us because he wanted to unload his guns or just what, but we got strafed. And we lost a man, and 3 others were wounded. My gun tub was blown up. I was not in it. I was at the other side, on the other, I was the port side. I was over on the starboard side helping a gun that was jammed. And I was helping do that when my gun tub was blown up. The fellow that was in it was killed.
Air raids in the Mediterranean, Algiers, and torpedoed aboard a tanker in the Gulf of Oman in the Arabian Ocean there, and they sunk 4 tankers that night because the Germans were after the tankers. Had some shipmates perish aboard it, 6 of them, 3 Merchant Marine and 3 Navy, and about 20 that were wounded, depth charged while we're in the water, and fortunate to be picked up and get back alive.
We got 2 torpedoes that were in the forward of the bridge, probably in number 1 hold, number 2 hold. I was standing in the alleyway on the port side, and I was facing inward to the inner part of the ship, and I could feel this big, tremendous concussion and shudder that it just vibrated that whole ship. It was just vibrating like that. And I was talking to a couple of my shipmates there, and the one guy that had been torpedoed before said, "That's it."
Allied troops were advancing up through Italy, and despite the fact the Italians were by now knocked out of the war, the Germans were still putting up a stiff defense. More and bigger convoys with essential war goods kept coming, and the German air attacks increased almost on a round-the-clock basis.
These Henkel 111s came in. There were 6 of them. So the first one that come in, I got that one, and there was women pilots in them. And we had subs trying to attack us from the water, the other side, and they were on the shore side of Italy in Spain. So they started diving in at us to torpedo, and I got the first one. So I told the guys, I said, when you could see their eyes in the cockpit of the plane, I says, open fire, because they'll start turning up their bellies to drop their torpedoes, and we'll knock them all out. Well, they did. We got all 4 of them out of the 6.
When we were getting ready to jump over off the ship at the stern, there was no more lifeboats left. There was nothing left for us except for a little oval-shaped donut-like. It had a little net in the center, so we threw that over, and I tied it off to the railing until we could all get ready to jump at one time, because otherwise it would drift away.
Final victory in Italy and control of the Mediterranean had its deadly price, especially during the invasions of Sicily, Salerno, and Anzio, where merchant ships were continually unloading supplies and troops. Under ceaseless attacks by German aircraft and shore batteries, armed guard gunners aboard these ships kept up a constant defense for days without let up.
And we realized that if we didn't separate, that none of us were going to make it. And so we cut all the boats loose and said every boat for itself, and the other boats we had, we had a first mate, the second mate in a couple of the other boats. But anyway, we were out there 9 days anyway, and but we had storms. I would say a good 4 to 5 times while we were out there, big waves, and it's hard to believe that somebody can live through that kind of thing.
And we was getting fire across our ship into the water. They didn't have our range, and I figured that they were out of torpedoes because they didn't even try to torpedo us. They were trying to blow us with the shells. So I told the gunnery officer, I said, give me the range. They don't have our range, but I want their range. He got me the range. We set it in on the gun, and I told the pointer, I says, now, I said, when they fire again, I says, you have this train in on them, and when they fire right back at them. Pull the trigger and let her have it. And he did. And then all 4th of July let loose.
Perhaps the largest loss of armed guard lives of the war during a single enemy raid occurred on December 2nd, 1943, at the small Italian port of Bari. Merchant ships, while unloading supplies for British forces, were hit by a surprise heavy German air attack.
That night at 7 o'clock they came over and they bombed all the ships along the breakwater wall. And I had my crew firing right up above us to protect our ship from getting hit. Well, with all the goings on in that raid, they set the ships that got blown up. The water was all on fire from the oil of the ships, caught a fire. And we took on a deck plate, and the skipper, of the merchant marine skipper, thought that we took a bomb, and he hollered, abandon ship. Well, we had a bunch of Filipino longshoremen on, and they all just jumped right over the side into the burning water.
In the course of only 20 minutes, 17 ships were sunk. Some had Navy Armed Guard gun crews that never reached their guns in time to defend themselves.
And he took a chunk of shrapnel right in his chest, and he fell over dead right there in the gun tub. And then when they hollered abandon ship, well, we all got off. We got him down, and I never did find out what happened to him. And we loaded up into the lifeboats.
One such ship, the Liberty SS John Harvey, took 2 direct hits and blew apart. 28 Navy Armed Guardsmen died, along with 38 merchant seamen. A total of 54 Navy Armed Guard personnel were lost during those brief, disastrous minutes.
They came in the next morning, and he looked at all the ships that were blown up when he told me this, and he says, you know, he says, it scared the death right out of me. That was the first thing I ever saw of my time in the service, of where ships were blown up like that.
The Navy Armed Guard and the merchant seamen faced an enemy in the Pacific whose strategy of conducting submarine warfare was much different than that of the Germans. While the German U-boat captains sometimes provided food, medical aid, and a direction toward land for their attacked victims, the Japanese, according to official records, most often killed the survivors. One of the Imperial Navy's most sadistic was Submarine Captain Arizumi, commander of the dreaded I-8.
After taking 103 survivors on board the submarine as prisoners, we sailed north, leaving a trail of bodies in the Indian Ocean who had been shot, stabbed, bayoneted, and beheaded in cold blood, with the last 20 prisoners tied together by rope in a human chain and towed underwater as the I-8 submerged.
That was a prelude to the horror that also awaited the survivors of the SS Jean Nicolette.
The captain gave the abandon order, so I ran down and helped get a lifeboat over the side, and we got in it. This Jap sub came up and told us to quit rowing, and they had machine guns and stuff trained on us. Not much we could do about it. And there was a young kid, I think he was about 17, he's up in the bow of the boat. He was the first one that the Japs grabbed. They shot him through the head.
Out of 100 crewmen and passengers, 77 were brutally murdered, and 19 of the 28 armed guardsmen were among those slain.
All of a sudden you could hear the air coming out of the air tanks, you know, and I knew then that they were going to dive, and which they did. And I got caught in that gun when it submerged, and I finally got out of that mess.
Following the war, the Allied military put to death 920 Japanese and sentenced another 3,000 to prison for war crimes. June 6, 1944, the greatest military invasion force in the history of mankind was launched by the Allies on the coast of Normandy. Merchant ships played a major role in bringing in troops and supplies on the beachheads. Under constant attack from the Luftwaffe and shore batteries, it was reported that some Navy armed guardsmen never left their gun positions for 72 hours.
Right off our starboard quarter, the Susan B. Anthony, a troop ship with a full load of troops, took a mine and went down rather rapidly. And also, coming into Omaha, we plowed through an awful lot of dead bodies. Those are the things that stick with me.
The supply ships needed harbors, so artificial ones were built, and these needed to be protected by some sort of artificial breakwaters. This was solved by purposely sinking more than 75 ships, which included 27 merchant ships, at specific locations to help form the harbors. Navy armed guard gunners took up positions on the scuttled ships and defended the harbors against violent shore-based enemy artillery and dive bombers. For several weeks, the armed guardsmen never moved from those ships, continually fighting off German attacks until they were finally relieved by the Army. Within 1 month following D-Day, over 1 million men were brought ashore, including nearly 200,000 vehicles and 650,000 tons of supplies. The landscape of the war in the Pacific was totally different than that of the North Atlantic. The ocean was 3 times larger, the weather sometimes so hot you could hardly breathe, and the land battles were fought on islands sometimes so small you could literally throw a rock across them. American cargo ships were constantly making dangerous runs in support of the fierce fighting that raged on Guadalcanal and New Guinea. Whereas the North Atlantic and Mediterranean runs were made up almost entirely of convoys, the Pacific runs, although some convoys were deployed, consisted more of ships going it alone to reach their destinations.
And the Coast Watchers and Navy patrol planes called in and said there was a big squadron of Jap planes coming toward us. There had been several numbers thrown at us. At the time, I got the numbers of how many planes there was, They said there was 120 planes.
The war in the Pacific for the armed guard and their fellow merchant seamen became a nightmare when the invasion was launched on the Philippines and Okinawa. During these engagements, the Japanese unleashed a desperate fury for survival never before seen in the history of warfare, the attack on American supply ships and Navy warships by kamikaze suicide planes.
In the time that we were in the battle with them, there was 97 planes shot down, is what I was told at the time.
Some of the worst kamikaze attacks on merchant ships occurred in the Philippines' Leyte Gulf. Among those hit was the Alcoa Pioneer. 6 armed guardsmen were killed and 8 others wounded. A Silver Star was awarded to armed guardsman Patrick Henry Stevens, who, while badly burned and one arm almost severed, kept firing his 20-millimeter gun from a flaming gun tub. The Japanese kamikaze attacks at Leyte claimed 164 armed guardsmen killed, wounded, and missing. But the gunners also had their say by destroying more than 120 of the suicide planes.
It was an experience that was scary. I don't really want any more of them. But it's something that has never been with me the rest of my life.
After taking the Philippines and making an end run around several Japanese island bases, American forces moved quickly to the very doorstep of the Japanese Empire, Okinawa. During the invasion, the kamikaze attacks intensified to its highest point of the war. The enemy claimed their kamikaze attacks sunk nearly 300 ships, but the toll on their suicide efforts was even more staggering. 4,615 kamikaze pilots were killed for the honor of their emperor, and a great many of these were shot down by armed guard gunners before they could hit their target. August 6th, 1945, the first atom bomb ever used in warfare was dropped on Hiroshima. Then, on August 9th, the second bomb fell on Nagasaki. The effects of the 2 bombs demoralized the Japanese and brought about their unconditional surrender on August 14th.
One night in particular, following the end of the war, all of the ships, or at least most of them, and a lot of gun installations on shore opened up to celebrate the end of the war. And all you could see was a sky full of tracers.
Now, more than half a century later, there are certain revisionists who have come forth claiming the United States should apologize for dropping the atom bombs.
The bomb? You betcha, that was the best thing they could have ever done. It saved so many of our lives, because, you know, they estimated there'd be a possibility of 1 million of our people and the Japanese killed on an invasion. I think it was a great, wise decision by President Truman.
My God, to pull what they did on us, and then expect us to go in and then who would expect us to go in and invade over there and lose so many men? Oh, they did the right thing, absolutely. Ask the people who were, I played bridge with a lady who was a prisoner over there. Let her talk about it.
More than 50 years has passed since the end of World War II. For some of the surviving armed guardsmen, what happened to them on those ships so long ago has faded, but certainly not forgotten. Today, the newfound camaraderie that has developed between these veterans because of the growing Navy Armed Guard Veterans Association and their various reunions has helped a great many of these veterans to finally deal with the more painful of these memories and remember more clearly those good memories and strong friendships that came out of the war.
Just see so many people that get happy because we found some ships we got at least 15, 20 off of one ship back together again after 50 years, and I think it's just amazing.
Attending these reunions are really great. In fact, I didn't know the Armed Guard existed until after 50 years after the war. And because of finding out about the Armed Guard Association, I was able to locate an old shipmate of mine, a guy by the name of Don Volker, who was our boatswain mate. And Don was quite a guy. I remember when we used to hold inspections every Saturday. When we were overseas, it didn't matter. The lieutenant wanted to hold inspections of our quarters every Saturday morning. And I remember they walked into the quarters I was in, And Don Volker came in with his clipboard, going to write down all the infractions and so forth. And there was an ashtray sitting there with filled full of cigarette butts and ashes. And the lieutenant didn't see it, but Don picked up that ashtray and stuck it in his pocket so that the rest of us guys wouldn't get in trouble.
And I'm meeting one of the guys that was on board ship with me, that was on the life raft with me. And this is the first time that I've met him in 52 years.
If we don't find these guys now, let them know that we are meeting, and it 10 to 15 years down the line, it'll be a lost cause.
There aren't many years left for these surviving members of this little-known branch of the Navy, and they've been waiting a long time to receive the national recognition and honor they deserve.
It is sad indeed that too many of the Armed Guard veterans of World War II, other than the ones on this video, may never be heard and will take their active participations of battles and hardships with them when they pass on. Here it is over 50 years later, and these sailors of the so-called forgotten Navy, not seeking glory for themselves, for they very well know what they accomplished, wish only to be remembered and treated with the same level of respect as that which was given unto other branches of our World War II fighting forces. So far, there have been a few states that have finally declared their openness to bring forward some sort of official recognition for the Navy Armed Guard veterans of their particular state, the New York State Conspicuous Service Cross, which is New York State's highest military honor. Not long ago, I became the state's first test case and was ceremoniously awarded the citation by Senator Dollinger. Prior to the presentation, in a letter on file in Albany, I stated I would not accept the award until all of the Armed Guard veterans who truly merited and could qualify in New York State for said citation were recognized. I pray that what we have accomplished in New York State will be an encouragement to other Armed Guard veterans groups to seek recognition within their own states. And hopefully, that the United States government itself, after having cited every World War II branch of our military, including the Merchant Marine, will finally bring about a national commendation for this deserving special branch of unsung Navy heroes.
During those long war years, foreign correspondents were writing back home about the heroic achievements of our fighting men in all branches of the military. That is, all branches except the Navy Armed Guard. The Armed Guard had no one on board to report back about what it was like to be on the flaming deck of a tanker in the Mediterranean, adrift for weeks on a life raft in the icy North Atlantic, captured and bayoneted on the deck of an enemy submarine in the Indian Ocean, or one of the last survivors of a kamikaze attack on a Liberty ship in the Pacific. They came from the farms and cities, from every corner of the country. Some had never seen the ocean before, let alone a ship. Some were as young as 15, and some lost their lives within hours of leaving port for the first time. They wore no special insignia to distinguish who they were, and while they received a special citation and commendation from the governments of Russia, Great Britain, and France, they've yet to receive any such honor from their own government. But for every soldier or Marine that stormed a beachhead, for every air bombardment or enemy aircraft shot down, and for every tank, plane, and round of ammunition supplied to the Allies, it never would have been accomplished without the Navy Armed Guard protecting the ships of the Merchant Marine. The Armed Guard motto was, "We aim to deliver," and they did. more information about the United States Navy Armed Guard during World War II, look for these following books. Unsung Sailors by Justin Glelchoff, published by the Naval Institute Press, Annapolis, Maryland. We Delivered by Lyle Dupre, published by Sunflower Press, Manhattan, Kansas. And They Aim to Deliver by Charles Jackson, published by Ashogan Books, Cary, North Carolina. Since the release of this documentary, the President of the United States signed into law an act finally initiated by Congress officially honoring the United States Navy Armed Guard for their heroic service during World War II.